Well, I'm making videos today. I ought to get this one out of the way. It's been on my mind for a while lately. And um, I went through my whole entire closet of art supplies this week, mainly last night, all the way up until this morning. I went through everything. I went through my watercolor and I compared watercolor in the pan with watercolor from the tube. I compared that watercolor with watercolor pencils. That was earlier in the week. I compared that watercolor with the Neocolor 2 oil pastels. Now, Neocolor 2 oil pastels are better off if you use them like you use pastels and then add water to blend the pastels. Like I said in the very first video that I made about Neocolor 2s. Okay. Um, I compared my Neocolor 2s, my Inktense, and all this to gouache and acrylic. And when I say gouache and acrylic, I mean gouache and acrylic straight from the tube. The Himi gouache, um, people say they see a difference. I don't see a difference between the Himi gouache and the gouache from the tube. However, I did not do the tube test yet. Um, I'm going to do that before within my last day off this week, I'm going to do that today. I'm going to do the tube test. If I see a difference, which I might, I'll let you know. Um, but what I want to talk to you today is exactly that. Like, what is real paint medium and what is the new paint mediums? What are the binders? Now, I don't know what the binders are. I don't make paint, okay? But I do know that from experience, and you will too, that any paint that you get out of the tube, even if it's a generic brand, is going to be more opaque and more saturated, maybe even more vibrant or vintage, maybe vintage is a better word, in color than what you're getting out of a pastel or a pencil. Now, out of all this stuff that I uh, played around with for the last 2 days and days earlier this week, the Neocolor 2s and the Inktense would be the winners as far as being able to survive on their own. But once I got into gouache, I really don't allow them to survive on their own anymore. I may underpaint. Now, Inktense, as far as drawing something small, like let's say you're drawing cartoons or you're drawing, um, illustration. If you do it right starting out, even the underpainting, if you do it right from the jump, and that's the thing, you got to understand about water soluble pastels and pencils is that you don't have the time to play around with it like you do with actual paint. Now, I've done reviews. I've listened to almost everybody on YouTube talk about how great these pastels and pencils are, and you can layer and layer and layer and layer and layer. They must be using the watercolor paper from heaven, okay? Because I've bought some of the best. The only thing I haven't used them on so far is like the watercolor paper pads that are real thick, almost like they got wood in them or something, or canvas. I haven't done that yet. But what I have, I just got these in the mail. Um, these are cold press easy blocks. These are blocks. So they can handle a lot more water and a lot more moisture than your average watercolor paper. And they're real small, and you can only get them in like 15 sheets a pop, and I don't like that. But I like the way they're handling the paint, all of them. Okay. Um, I have, let me go over the supplies that I have. Let me start off with this Charvin Paris water soluble chalk pastels. You can look this stuff up. They are good. They are better if you use them dry. No watercolor paper that I put them on really makes them stand out as wet. Unless you use them both wet and dry. Now, there's this lady, an Indian lady here on YouTube that was illustrating a drawing she did with these pastels. She did all the details wet, but all the background and all the colors for any clothing or hair and all that stuff, she just let it stay chalky dry. Okay. And I had to look at the video 3 times to realize she was doing that. I thought she was just wetting the whole thing, like we regularly do in painting, and that's not what she was doing. So yes, I experimented with it again after she did that, and I would do the outline. Like, let's say we draw a circle, I would do the outline wet. You like you can make the circle black. Use water to soften and darken the outline. But when I put the colors inside the circle, it was better to let them stay dry like regular soft chalk pastels than to wetten them, because when you wetten them, the colors are like all over the place. They're not blending into one another the way they're supposed to be. And so the Charvin, they work really good as dry pastels. When you wet them, then they seem kind of catchy. It seems like you wonder, what am I doing wrong here? Like, why are they so messy? Why aren't the colors giving you a straight, simple blend and all like that? So that's Charvin. They're better off dry. That's the bad news. They're better off dry and only wet when you're adding details. Okay. I have all kinds of oil pastels. I have Prima, which is a good brand, but not as good as Mungyo. I have Mungyo, and I have Neocolor 2s. I have Cretacolor. These are all watercolor or oil pastels, whatever you want to call it. Cretacolor is a good brand that doesn't get enough credit. And then next to Cretacolor would be the Mungyo. It doesn't get enough credit either. These are good brands, whereas Cretacolor, you're pretty much getting 80 pastels, or what is it, 70 some pastels, maximum, compared to the 80 that you're getting from Neocolor 2. Neocolor 2 and Cretacolor, I think, are the best. Everybody else is going down in number, as far as how good they work, as far as competing with real paint. This is what we're talking about. We're talking about all these other mediums competing with real paint. Okay. So the Mungyo and the Prima and the Cretacolor are pretty good. Mungyo is very good. I think Cretacolor and Mungyo are on the same level. Okay, good paint. But again, it all depends on how you use it. Like, and you can layer. And you can go back and fix it once it's dry. But again, none of these like you can with regular watercolors, gouache, or acrylic. Okay? But out of all these oil pastels out there, Neocolor is number one. Neocolor is the best. If you're going to do anything artistic quality style, I would go with Neocolor too. Spend the extra money, put some money aside, spend the money, and get it. Now, I don't do art every day like some people, but I tell you what, I've had these Neocolors for what 3 years now. Never ran out. The black has ran out a little bit. And I did go get another white, but that's not because it was running out. It was because it broke. But Neocolor 2, and I compared it with all the others, and all of them are good. Even the portfolio is good until you get to the browns. The browns tend to act up on the cheaper versions of oil pastels, but they're all good. But again, compared to actual acrylic, actual gouache, and actual watercolor from the tube, or maybe the expensive versions like Caran d'Ache or you know Holbein or some of them, even in the cups, are they competing? Are they actually giving you the same thing? It is not the same thing. If you have a watercolor pastel and you compare it with actual watercolor that is artist quality watercolor from the tube, especially the tubes, you're not getting the same thing. Let me say this about, as I talk about Inktense, let me say this. Whenever you take an item that is dry, now oil pastels are oily, so they don't tear into the paper the way pencils do. But when you put a pencil down on paper and you begin to paint that drawing or whatever with that pencil, you are already tearing into the tooth of the paper. So when you put the water down, you only got like you got seconds to get each part, each little piece right before you start seeing little crumblies or you start to see little paper crumblies. You only got so much time to do it right. But actual acrylic, especially acrylic or acrylic wash or gouache, when you put it down, it primes the paper. Just like, for example, gesso is made out of acrylic. It's acrylic paint, right? It's a primer. So when you use real acrylic or real gouache, especially out of the tube or the Himi gouache, even that, it really primes the paper. So any color you put on after that is away from the tooth of the paper. It is just color on top of color. You can layer until you die. And I love that about acrylic, gouache, acrylic gouache, and even watercolor. Now I noticed today I was using watercolor out of one of them pans, and it's a real cheap version that I got at like Hobby Lobby. And I was messing with that because they're fairly new. I haven't hardly touched them. Okay? And I was using that, and I was doing a little design with it, and it went down smoothly, but the color was kind of like, I couldn't get the chalky substance in these pans to like really turn into complete color. So when I would put the color down, it wasn't really moving the way I'm used to. It was, and first of all, the color, the pans, they, you know, the way they have it in the pans was like chalky pastels, okay? And you got to put the water down and you got to twist the brush in there and really get the brush saturated compared to real watercolor, okay? You got to get the brush really saturated to get a good, strong texture. Um, and I noticed that today, like here you go here. Um, this is real watercolor straight out of the tube. There's probably about a pinch of water for each color. Okay, now I went over this. I started off with watercolor from Hobby Lobby that was in a pan, and I went over these, and well, I did them with the pan watercolors first, and the colors were all over the place. I just couldn't get them to like sit still. And then I went in the pan. I mean, I went in the tube, and I went back over these with the tube colors, and then I went back over with a little bit more water to smoothen out the color a little bit because it was a little bit more opaque than watercolors are supposed to be. But what I've learned today is that watercolor out of the tube is the best thing ever. There's no pastel or pencil that's going to compete with it. You can use the pencil maybe for some details, but or the pastel maybe for some details, but the actual paint, especially when you're painting mass, like painting within the square or painting within, you know, the background or whatever, you want a smoother blend. So that's going to come out of the tube. That's not going to come from a pastel or a pencil. Okay? And I learned that today. I don't really get into watercolors. But after today, I might be in, because watercolor from the tube is a totally different thing than my Neocolor tubes. It's a totally different thing than buying watercolor out of, you know, and using watercolor out of a pan. It's a totally different thing. Totally different thing. But let me say this. It all starts with acrylic. It all starts with acrylic. Now, I'm messing with oil paint today. And these are all just little swatches I did to mess with the paint. Now, I don't know if you can see how dark this is. And it's like completely dry, because I used Gamsol. Well, now that the paint is drying, the colors are coming out more. But this was oil paint, and it's completely dry. They tell you not to do this, but I did it anyway. What I don't like about oil paint, according to this, is that the colors are too dark. They're not as really vibrant in that. Okay, I don't really get into oil paint. And after today, the cleanup was a mess, and I really don't like oil paint. Did I say I don't like oil paint? I don't get into oil paint. But I understand why people love it, though. Thank God I'm in the comics. I'm in the comic novels and stuff like that. I'm not really in the canvas drawing. Or I think I would have to be in the oil paint. But it all starts with acrylic. It all starts with acrylic. And then you go down. You go down in cause you know, this is acrylic right here. Okay, this is acrylic. The colors, the vintageness of the colors, you cannot tamper with that. Okay, I'm just messing with a little bit of abstract stuff to explain the difference between, you probably can't see it here, but I can. Okay. Alright. Acrylic is number one. This is Acrylic Wash. And compared to gouache, Now the colors for regular gouache are a little bit more vibrant. Like when you get to the light colors, like your yellows and your pinks and that, the colors are more vibrant. But this is not Neocolor 2. This is actual gouache. This is Himi gouache. This is Himi gouache. Beautiful. Beautiful finish. I love it. Okay. This is acrylic gouache out of the two. And I just love it. Okay. I really love it. Okay. And this is the Turner acrylic gouache. Okay. I love it. I absolutely love it. I don't get that when I do Inktense or I do Neocolor 2. I don't get that look. Now here is the Inktense that I did. I don't know if you can tell the difference. But see, that's beautiful, but that's not real paint. That's not the kind of look you get from acrylic or from watercolor or from, anything. Any of the traditional paints like oil, acrylic, watercolor, gouache. This is Neocolor 2. Now I love Neocolor 2s for the kind of stuff that I will be doing in the near future. I wouldn't waste gouache and acrylic wash on that. But I think Neocolor 2, like I said before, Neocolor 2 and Inktense, this is Inktense, they are the winners as far as competing with actual paint medium. Now, this is not actual paint medium though. I don't know what the binders are in these paints, but they're slightly different. With Neocolor 2 and Inktense, they're slightly different than your regular acrylic and your regular gouache. Okay, they're slightly different. Even your regular watercolor, they're slightly different. Okay, here's Neocolor 2. This one I did over again. I ripped it up and did it over again. Now, what's good about this is that's pastel. Even though that's water soluble, and I did it over again. I ripped the old one up and did, well, no, I didn't. I have it in, here's the old one here. Okay. I didn't do too good. I didn't go back over this one. I just let the colors run and dry, and then, But this one here, I kind of like it. That is Neocolor 2. And that is like the best of Neocolor 2 in my opinion. That there is a keeper. And I think the Mungyo can give the same effect. Mungyo is more even, has more oil in it, or wax, whichever binder it is, in it than Neocolor 2. I think it would be oil. Now, however they get oil and water to mix together to make these binders, this is pretty good. But it's still not competitive, or it does not beat. It might work as a good underpainting, or it might work as something, a totally different medium. But it does not really compare to real, honest gouache or acrylic or watercolor. It's just what it is. It's Neocolor 2. Okay, Neocolor 2. All right. So again, it all starts with acrylic. It starts with acrylic, and then we go down to watercolor. Acrylic is paint that when you get it on there, you got so many seconds or a couple minutes to get it right, and then it dries. But you can, if you don't like it, you can go over it. Even with light paint, you can go over it and fix it and totally cover up. It might take you, depending on what kind of acrylic paint you have, it might take you a couple layers, but you can go over it and completely change And I didn't know. Someone said on YouTube yesterday that acrylic is cheaper than watercolor and gouache, and I'm thinking, really? I didn't see it that way when I shopped. I thought that regular acrylic would be the most expensive, but maybe it's been a while since I bought acrylic. I have acrylic wash, and I know that when I bought that acrylic wash online, it was expensive, more expensive than any of my watercolor materials, and more expensive than it was about almost expensive as the Neocolor too, if I remember correctly. Especially 40 pastels, but um, it starts off with acrylic, then watercolor. Watercolor is like the most blendable paint you'll use other than oil. Oil paint, you know, watercolor is the most blendable paint you'll use. And I'm starting to have, after this weekend or after these 2 days of going through my closet and opening up paint that I haven't used yet and using watercolor straight from the tube, which this is my first time doing this. I only had like a pinch of water for each color. Um, Watercolor straight from the tube is different than, Neocolor 2. It's different than Inktense. It's different than um, watercolor pans, especially the cheap versions. You might have to go with Karen Dash or Derwent or something in order to get good watercolor in a pan. But the tube, and these tubes are cheap. They're not even. These are like a generic brand. These are like a generic brand, and it's just amazingly beautiful. That is generic watercolor. Generic. And it kind of primes the paper, not as much as acrylic or gouache, but it too has a little bit of its own primer. And I can go back over this. Once I let um, once I let my other like pencils, watercolor pencils, and my Neocolor 2s, or even my Inktense, once I let them dry and I go over it, you're really, really pushing it. Matter of fact, you can't even go over it by wetting the paper. You have to take a wet brush and go over the pencil or go over the pastel, because you don't want the pastel to cut into the paper, because as soon as you put in, and I also have the Faber-Castell watercolor markers and the Tombow watercolor markers. I have those too. And as soon as, the Tombows are the worst. As soon as you put them down, you can barely touch them ever again. A lot of times it's better not to even use water with the Tombows, because they're already water soluble. When you put them down, you're already wetting the paper. They're very saturated when you put them down. And the Faber-Castell. I think the Tombows are a little bit better than the Faber-Castell. The Faber-Castell, I think the colors are prettier, even though there's less colors with the Faber-Castell. But as soon as you wet them, you're done. You try to go over it again, you got to be really, 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 really careful. But with gouache or acrylic wash, you can layer and layer and layer and layer until grandma comes up from the dead. I've taken stuff, and even while the paper is wet, Now, these other mediums like your Inktense and your Neocolor 2s, if you're going to touch it at all, you have to wait till it is completely dry. But I've went over acrylic and went over gouache, okay, especially from the tube or the Himi gouache. I went over it while it was wet. I went over it while it was wet. And it's not so much that acrylic, that gouache, it's not so much that, well, yeah, it is. It is that that gouache is more like acrylic as far as it's beginning to dry, even before it's completely dry, you can go over it light to dark or dark to light, okay? And when it's dry, you can just keep going and going and going and going and going and going and going, okay? Um, Gouache has that in common with acrylic as far as the layering and as far as um, being able to go back over it even while it's wet. Okay? Because like I said, gouache and acrylic prime the paper. You know what I mean? It's like starting a painting with gesso. Gesso's in the binder, obviously. Okay? So, it just primes the paper while you're painting. That's what I love about acrylic wash and gouache. Okay? I think I said everything. I have, and I just named you all the water-soluble stuff that I have, but it all starts off with acrylic, then watercolor. Oil is, I'm going to tell you something. As far as oil goes, let me say this real quick. I rather work with oil pastel or oil sticks. If I'm going to get oily in my medium, I rather work with oil pastels or oil sticks. Like Black Bean CMS, his channel. Like he shows you, he doesn't just use one brand of oil pastels. Now I will say, now this is not water-soluble media, but if you have a good brand of oil pastels, okay, you can use them just like you use oil paint, like the Sennelier. You can use Sennelier like you use oil paint. It'll go all over the paper, anywhere you want, just like oil paint. There's no brush involved. You don't even need Gamsol or baby oil and all like that until you have you have some kind of thick spot there where you want to flatten the oil to the paper, or it's not blending the way you want it properly. A lot of the cheap brands do that. You think you're going somewhere and then you have this spot in the middle of the paper that just won't break down and blend. Then you need to either get some Gamsol or some, baby oil. One of these days, I'll have to tell you how I use Gamsol, which is against the law. I use Gamsol as a medium. I use it with my, I did a video on this. I use Gamsol, I call it Gamsol painting. I use Gamsol with both my Caran d'Ache Neocolor 1, which is water resistant. Okay, wax pastel, but water resistant, not water soluble. And regular oil pastels like my Cretacolor Expressionist, or I have a little bit of Caran d'Ache, small set of Caran d'Ache Neo Pastel. I use Gamsol / baby oil to break these items down. I hardly ever even attempt to use pastels or anything in that family without Gamsol or baby oil. It just, it's ridiculous to use it. To me, you're going to need it. You might as well get it out, even with the best, unless you're going to do the whole picture in Sennelier, But see, I shouldn't be talking about that because that's another video. But my point is, when it comes to oil painting, we're talking about paint, I rather use oil pastels. That's how oil pastels begin to be a thing because of oil paint. If you go back to history and time and look at some of these artists, I'm sorry, you will find out that people have demonstrated, you know, the oil painters with oil pastels. And then today you can use a fixative or whatever and seal these oil pastels while they still look like oil. You know, when it comes to oil, I'd rather use oil pastels than oil paint. I think the oil pastel colors are more vibrant and softer in color and brighter, and oil pastel is just as messy but less of a cleanup, and um, it is what it is. And so today, messing around with oil paint, I have new respect for oil pastels. I don't really get into oil pastels. I like water soluble media, but after messing around with oil paint today, I've become a new fan for oil pastels. I'm a new fan now again. So there's going to be days when I'm going to get out my oil pastels and really, really, really go to town, okay? But it starts off with acrylic, then watercolor, okay? Then gouache, and then acrylic gouache, okay? You want to start off with acrylic to do your paints, get them done simple. They're done. There's nothing to add or do or anything. Plain and simple. If you're that good an artist, you don't really need to paint to good artists. Don't really need to paint to be slow. Do it. Know how you want to do it. Put it down the first time, get it done right, and move on. Okay. You can do that with acrylic. Then you have watercolor, which, like oil paint, is very easy to move around, almost like oil paint. But I'm not a fan of the lightness. I am a fan of this stuff. I am a fan of that. Right out of the tube, that's something that I'm going to be doing more often. I am a fan of that, as far as watercolor goes. But as far as watercolor, you put it down, you can see the paper behind the paint and that. No, I like the paint to be saturated and more opaque all the way around. That's why I'm into acrylic and acrylic wash and gouache the way I am lately. Okay. And then gouache is like, they say it's like opaque watercolor. That is very true. And gouache, gouache really has a mind of its own. It really does. It does have a mind of its own. Okay, and I love gouache. Um, but I'm having a hard time between gouache and acrylic wash. There's something about that acrylic wash that stands out above everything in this stack of watercolor paper here. This acrylic wash really stands out, and like I said, I've yet to just use. See, the other ones look like I could go over them. I wouldn't touch this. This is acrylic. I wouldn't touch this. I don't feel I need to go back and mess with this. It is done. It is complete. Okay? But the other ones look like I could go back over them. Okay? Acrylic wash is going to be one of my number one items, and so is gouache, regular gouache. And like I said, I've yet to do. I started off using acrylic. The first time I ever painted anything, I got it recorded on my phone. It was gouache when I actually did a painting. I'm just now getting into watercolor. But I started off with acrylic. I love the texture, and I love the saturation. I love the thickness of the paint to where you cannot see. Once the paint is down, the paint is in charge. That's the way I like it. When the paint hits the paper, it is in charge. When the colors hit the paper, they're in charge. That's what I like. But the Neocolor 2s and the Inktense, they come close, but yet at the same time, you're not, that is not gouache, that is not regular acrylic. There's acrylic in the binder. In order for Inktense to be permanent, there has to be acrylic in the binder. And they are permanent to the most part. There's certain colors that if you go back over them, and they even have acrylic, regular acrylic paints that do the same things depending on what brand. Certain colors you can still move the color around a little bit, especially right after it begins to dry. But there has to be acrylic in the binder for Inktense pencils to be permanent. And I have the Inktense paint as well. And the Inktense paint does handle your drawings and that differently than the pencils, but it still does not prime the paper. You cannot layer and layer while it's wet. You have to wait till it's completely dry, and even when it's completely dry, if you try to go back over it, even with the paint and not using the pencil, Inktense, okay, you are pushing it and you're tearing into the tooth of the paper, even more so than you would if you were using regular acrylic or acrylic wash or gouache, okay. Neocolor 2s, they are good when you use them like an oil pastel, and then use the water to seal them. You know, use them just like you're going to use regular oil pastels, and then use the water to seal the deal and make everything smoothie, and then let them dry like that. You move them around like you do oil pastels. That's why they're called water-soluble wax pastels, because you use them just like you use oil pastels, and then you use the water to smooth them around. Now it is true, and I've tested this out too this week, you know, you can get a watercolor effect instead of a pastel effect when you use less pastel with these water-soluble pastels, especially Neocolor 2. However, it's still not, where is it? It's still not this. It's still not traditional watercolor. When you use Neocolor 2 lightly, sure, you can get a good drawing, and it's easier to work with than regular watercolor. But when it dries and you compare it to traditional artist quality watercolor, that is not watercolor. That is a paint that was used as a watercolor. Same thing with Neocolor 2. Neocolor 2 is not alcohol markers. It's called Inktense, but it's not alcohol markers. It's not water-soluble markers. It is its own thing. Has its own binder. One of those binders is acrylic. I can promise you that. But only a small amount acrylic. Only a small amount. Just enough to make it permanent when it's dry. So, what am I saying here? The bottom line is that if you want to, like my plan in the beginning was to get into water-soluble pastels because I didn't like getting mess all over my hands in that. Okay, and when it comes to pastels, I think that you can get a pastel look with the Neocolor 2s, a pastel maybe slash watercolor look. But it's still more interesting, and you have more room and more manageability and more room to move around than you do with regular oil pastels. So the Neocolor 2s are a winner. The Inktense are a winner, but you got to really, really be careful how you use them again. Even though there's acrylic in the binder, you're not going to move them around the way you do acrylic. You're not going to create the drawing the way you would do acrylic or acrylic wash. When that painting is done and it's completely dry, you will know that that is Inktense, that's not acrylic. So that is not, it's not a good replacement for real watercolor pencils. Some people use Inktense pencils to replace watercolors or watercolor pencils. It's not a replacement for, it might be a good replacement against watercolor pencils, but it's not a real replacement for actual real watercolor. Okay, out of the tube, or the expensive versions even out of the pans. Okay, you want, even if you are a water soluble freak, whether you're into pastels or watercolor pencils or Inktense pencils, you want to learn how to paint, is the bottom line of what I'm saying. Don't just stop like I did this week. I decided to go through all the supplies in my closet, and I learned that I love my Inktense, I love my Neocolor 2s, but that doesn't mean that I'm done painting, because gouache and acrylic gouache, nothing compares to them. Nothing. I don't care whether you're drawing comics, illustration, landscapes, still lifes, whatever. Whatever you know your art style is, nothing is going to look better on paper than acrylic, number one, gouache or acrylic wash, number 2 and 3. Nothing. And then number 3 or number 4, watercolor. Actual watercolor, watercolor that is artist quality watercolor. The expensive brands, or the brands out of the tubes, the ones I used today were generic brands like Loewe Cornell. I think they're El Cheapos. But he might be a high class. I mean, his name goes around enough, so he might be high class. I don't know. These are supplies that were given to me compared to the supplies that I've spent a fortune on, like the Neocolor 2s and the Inktense. These supplies were given to me because I don't really get into watercolor that much, and I don't get into oil paint at all. So these were supplies that were given to me. But again, I just want you to know that have fun with your Neocolor 2s. Have fun with your Inktense and any water-soluble media you use, watercolor pencils and other pastels and markers and all like that. But they are not a replacement for real watercolor. They're not a replacement for real acrylic. Oh, one more thing. I tested the Posca pens to acrylic gouache. Okay? And that's acrylic. The Posca pen drawing that I did, I threw it out. I drew a cartoon of a guy, and I couldn't get the color to saturate right for me. Part of that is because I was using the bullet nib instead of the brush nib, because the brush nib dried out on me. But still, at the same time, even Posca pens do not compare to real acrylic. Now, Posca pens are acrylic, but there's a binder in there that makes them Posca pens instead of actual acrylic paint. Oh, they're a paint, and there is acrylic in the binder, just like in the Inktense. But it does not compare with real live acrylic paint or acrylic wash or even gouache. It's very saturated compared to alcohol markers or any paint marker that you might get out there. But it is not acrylic or acrylic wash. It's acrylic. Like some of the cheaper versions of acrylic, that is made for kids that you might use, some Crayola acrylic or something, but it is not real acrylic paint. There's a binder missing in there that makes it Posca instead of Acryla. You get what I'm saying? So, God bless you. I am DeRoy Cruz. This is going way too long, but I'm glad I was able to get it all out. I knew this was going to take a while, so I hope you didn't mind. Go through all your art supplies like I did. If you are into the water-soluble media, which I am, big time. I love water-soluble more than paint, but don't stop painting. Because anybody that paints knows that the binders that are used for water-soluble media, like pastels and pencils, are slightly different and of less quality than actual traditional paints. Acrylic gouache, and watercolor. The traditional acrylic wash, and watercolor. Nothing else compares to those three. Okay? Again, oil paint can be competed with oil pastels or oil sticks, but nothing compares. I've learned this week. Nothing compares to acrylic wash, or watercolors that are professional quality, straight out of the tube. Your watercolor pencils, your Inktense, your Neocolor 2s, and all the little cousins in between the two do not stand up in quality painting and to the paper and the finished product when it is done. Do not stand up to acrylic wash, and gouache, and real watercolor. They don't stand up. They don't. The comparison makes your water-soluble media look cheap compared to real paint. Okay? I just wanted to throw that out there. And God bless you. I hope this helps. I don't even know the title of this video. That's going to be a hard one. But I think I'll call it Traditional Paints versus New Media. Something like that. New paint medium. Yeah. Yeah. That's what I'll call it. Traditional paints compared to new paint mediums. Okay. God bless you, DeRoy Cruz. Thank you for watching.